Welcome to the Go Electric Fleet Show. This is where we sit down and chat about EV fleets, infrastructure, and more. Join us as we explore EV fleets here in BC. All right, honestly, I would be so down to take that electric seaplane. Like, I've taken Harbour Air before, once before, and it was an awesome experience. One aspect that really stuck out to me, besides the fact that, a lot of people don't really realize this if you haven't taken a seaplane before, but you don't fly very high, right? You're very close to the ground compared to like a jetliner. So besides the fact that you get these awesome views, one thing that stuck out to me that I really liked this, but some people might not, was the noise and the vibration, right? I loved that. It kind of felt like I was really moving in a sense. But I can imagine that an electric plane would be an awesome experience because it's kind of like riding a trolley bus or one of those new battery buses after riding one of those old diesel ones, right? Suddenly all the noise has kind of vanished. It's a lot smoother. It's one of those things that, I feel like would be a fresh breath of air for people who might not appreciate the rickety nature of older seaplanes. Now, Shannon's in studio to talk with me about Harbour Air. Did they let you fly the plane, or were there some kind of like regulations that barred you from piloting an aircraft with zero experience? Tell me about it. Yeah,
they did not let me fly the plane. It turns out when you have a test plane, which is the case with the Harbour airplane, it is not operational yet. You do have to list the pilots, so anybody who is actually flying the plane, and they do check to make sure that they have the proper credentials.
And it's funny that we're kind of... I decided to go with that for the reason that I wanted to poke fun at regulations because, boy howdy, can that be extremely boring, extremely dry. And there's always good reason for it, right? You always want to make sure that people are doing things safely by the book without putting people in danger. And with new technologies, right, there's usually going to be a lot more of the regulatory hurdle that you're going to have to get over because we already know, for example, with internal combustion engine vehicles, the safety features, what needs to happen, how to get maintenance done, what happens in certain edge cases. Mm-hmm. But with electric cars, trucks, and, planes now, there's a lot of stuff that people have to take into account. So while you were there with Harbour Air, what kind of stood out to you about that environment, beyond even the regulations, the people, the processes? What did you find?
Yeah, so I, of course, had the pleasure of speaking with Blago. I also got to have a conversation beforehand with Erica Holtz, who is their lead engineer on this e-Beaver project for the electric seaplane. And, regulation is definitely an issue in doing some of this like more groundbreaking electrification work, of course. And the thing that kept coming up is that regulators are cautious, but of course, most people would want regulators to be cautious, right? You want to make sure that this new technology that's coming out is safe and safe for, people to ride in the back of an electric plane or safe for somebody to fly an electric plane, right? And we have this assumption kind of in our everyday lives that when we are allowed to do something, right? When we are allowed to go to the airport and get on board a plane, it is safe for us to ride in. And that's why those regulations exist, and that's why it's also difficult to change them.
Yeah.
Right? But what Erica had expressed was basically that you have companies like Harbour Air and some other companies who are doing this electrification work. You have regulators that want to see this work done, but everybody doesn't really know where to start in changing the rules about how alternate fuel sources are used within airplanes or even with vehicles as well on the road, right? And so it's a little bit of a maze to navigate, and sometimes even just finding the right person is difficult to start that conversation.
Yeah, because I imagine, I think most people are fairly familiar and or comfortable with the notion of electric cars now, right? Maybe you might not want them for your own, use. Maybe you go on a lot of like hyper long road trips in the middle of nowhere, but a lot of people, and there's a lot of people who are afraid of flying. I can imagine that a lot of the anxiety that comes with flying, and now you're saying, oh, this battery only has a limited range. What are you talking about? Batteries degrade. Oh no, et cetera, et cetera. This is literally brand new. Like, this is literally world first stuff. So it is kind of hard to even imagine where I would begin if I was in, in Erica's position, being a lead engineer. Like, how do I even get these engines certified? How do I even know where that process begins? You're literally being a trailblazer.
Exactly, right? You're the first people trying to figure it out. And Erica said something really wonderful, which is, it's not like this hasn't been done before. Airplanes were invented, right? We have gotten to where we are. So at one point, it was bizarre and seemed very dangerous for people to fly in an airplane. And, especially with seaplanes where you're landing in the water, right? But the period of time between then and now for all of those regulations around aviation to be developed was, 60 plus years. And when we're looking at electric planes, we're looking at a much shorter time span because the demand is much greater and more immediate for it, right? So we're looking at a much shorter timeline that's more in the range of like 10 years to try and get these electric planes off the ground, literally, right? And it was interesting to talk about how regulations around aircraft and, where they can be certified for operations are done, because you actually have to basically prove that the aircraft can operate, right? So it's not a question of saying like, these are the specifications for it. That mean that it will operate well, which is typically the case with vehicles, right? Like road vehicles. With the aircraft, you basically have to do like demonstration flights. So, the maximum elevation your aircraft is certified to is the maximum height it's ever flown, right? And the lowest operating temperature for your plane is the lowest operating temperature it's ever flowing, right? And that is how those regulations are created. So instead of trying to get all of those kind of limitations, like your upper bound and your lower bound at one time, a lot of that is done in phased approaches. But it's something that for us with, a normal seaplane, like the other planes in the Harbour Air fleet, most of us were not thinking about those stepped approaches or the amount of time it took to get to the bounds that they have now. Whereas with this e-Beaver, there's that, when I said before, there's that desire to have all of those bounds figured out basically immediately. And
with new technology, like, it's not that it's impossible, it's that it hasn't been done. So you're having to do that all yourself. Now, even trying to think about what you have to go through to demonstrate, let's say the airworthiness of this electric plane. I'm thinking about, because I'm a little bit of an aviation nerd. So I'm thinking about the struggles that airliners had getting their aircraft certified to fly over oceans with only two engines. Because for the longest time, you could only ever fly, jets over vast stretches of the Pacific or the Atlantic if you had 4 or 3 engines. Because, what if one of them goes out, right? So it's one of those things that took decades, to actually get clearance widespread for dual engine aircraft to fly trans-Pacific, transatlantic routes. And even today, the application process for a brand new aircraft to actually get that certification is a lengthy one. It's an expensive one as well. What kinds of challenges have you seen or heard from Harbour Air about trying to get this through all of the regulatory tape?
A lot of it has just been the kind of time aspect of it, right? So the amount of time it takes for all of these approvals to happen, but some of it has also been equipment-wise. So as it currently stands, only one person is in the plane at any given time. And so they've just now gotten to the point where they've been able to kind of rearrange some of the equipment in the plane to allow for a second seat. So now a second person will be able to ride in the plane, but now they have to go through the process, right, of like registering passengers who are going to be riding in the plane with the pilot, right? And they are flight crew, so they have to be registered in order to fly in this test plane.
It's interesting because when we look at the world of electric vehicles, we look at, let's say, there's a brand new fancy EV that's coming out. The very notion of only having one seat in an EV or being like having to register anyone who's driving in it it's kind of, in a sense, it's silly, but like these things are there for very good reason.
Well, and what they said to me was that if you're driving an EV on the road and something goes wrong, you can open the door and jump out. When you're flying a plane,
Yeah.
the option to open the door and jump out is not really there, right? You don't have an escape route.
Yeah.
Your escape route is an emergency landing, right?
Little bit more high stakes.
Little bit more high stakes, right? So like there's the understanding from their side as well, right? And I think that this always happens when we have businesses dealing with regulators, which is like you have the understanding of why that regulation exists. You might still be a little frustrated with it, but you get why it's there. And, you know, Harbour Air are not the only ones who deal with these regulations, right? The regulations exist in so many different industries. They might be provincial regulations like through WorkSafe BC. They might be through unions, right? They might be through company policies. You know, I've spoken to unions where they have a policy against staff lifting things up and out of a hatch. So they have to be able to slide it out flat, right? But these are things that everybody deals with. And you know, you just kind of have to figure out what the path is to maybe either change that regulation, which will obviously take some time, or to get around it by modifying the vehicle or things like that, right? And that's something that Harbour Air has done, which is instead of starting from the ground up and creating a new airplane, they are converting an existing airplane. And they did explain to me that they do cut down a lot of certification time by converting an existing airplane model versus creating something from the ground up.
Yeah, because there's already that regulatory base for you know, the airframe for that specific model. Exactly.
They already know that the frame can fly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's one thing that I was just thinking about here that I know that Harbour Air has, I believe it's at one point, or will continue to offer flights to Seattle. So they fly internationally, right? So that's another level of regulation. Like, did they talk about how all of these levels kind of stack on top of each other?
Yeah. So whenever you deal with aviation, and especially for Harbour Air, because this is, you know, looking like a new kind of business venture for them as well in actually doing these airplane conversions. So they are not only seeking certification from Canada, but they are also going to Europe, and they are also going to, you know, the FAA in the US to gain certification for this aircraft in those other markets so that they can convert Beaver airplanes that other companies own as well.
I know that some people might be watching this or listening to this and going, well, all I really want to do is, you know, grab a couple of, say, electric vans and help me carry around, you know, my plumbing equipment, right? Yeah. What kind of dawned on you about the process of making changes to your business from your trip to Harbour Air? Like, what kinds of things do you think that the average person, you know, who isn't trying to be a trailblazer and developing an entirely new way of movement, what kind of things do you think we can take? What kind of lessons can we learn from Harbour Air?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I started thinking about some of the limitations that, you know, we can have placed on like the operations of a business, even just by use of public infrastructure. Right. So one of the things I was thinking about was actually weight restrictions on roadways. So where I grew up, we had a lot of swampy areas. So there were quite a few roads where you could not drive vehicles with, you know, excess gross weights. So you couldn't drive a medium or a heavy duty vehicle on those roads because it broke them down. And with the EVs, a lot of them are a lot heavier than their gas equivalent. Right. And so there are a lot of ways that we have like limitations of the public infrastructure or regulatory issues that will come into effect maybe in ways that we didn't expect just because we're dealing with new vehicles.
And it's one of those interesting things where two entirely disparate things like, you know, trucks, you know, running down, you know, roads, you know, in a swampy area and electric seaplanes flying over the Salish Sea. In a weird way, it's thanks to regulation that we can actually have these two ideas kind of merge and make sense in the real world. Before we wrap up here, was there anything else that you took from Harbour Air that you feel might be helpful for somebody who's looking to explore the world of electrification?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, once you get started thinking about things like regulations and limitations and stuff like that, your brain can kind of go all over the place in all the different areas that it can possibly come up with electrification journeys. But I was really impressed by how well they have gone through this electrification project for this e-Beaver, and thinking about regulations, right? And talking to the regulators and working with them to figure out how they can make this possible on the timeline that they have kind of set out for passenger flights. Talking to the utilities, talking to the manufacturers of charging stations to make sure that they are able to operate on the docks that the planes park at. And I think really what we're seeing from some of the guests that we've had and some of the folks we've been able to talk to is that the people that are able to successfully do this electrification are the ones who really think it through, really go through this process and understand all of those different aspects of it.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks so much for sitting down and chatting with us. A huge thanks for today's guests, all the folks over at Harbour Air. The Go Electric Fleet Show is made possible by Plug-in BC. Hopefully you've taken something from today's episode. My name is Andrew, and you're all charged up and ready to go. Hey there. Thanks for joining us on the Go Electric Fleet Show. Please like and subscribe for more content about electric vehicle fleets in British Columbia and beyond.